Never underestimate someone based on their skin color, their gender, or the way they look, because the moment you do, you might just find yourself at the mercy of their power. It was a crisp Monday morning in downtown Chicago, and Officer Ted Marshall was strutting into the courtroom with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He wore his arrogance like a badge of honor, and his disdain for certain people, well, that wasn't exactly a secret. Holding onto the arm of a young black woman, he dragged her into the courtroom, smirking as he whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "I've seen your type 1,000 times. Always thinking you're above the law. Not today." The woman didn't respond. She walked silently, her dark eyes steady and composed, not giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. She was dressed simply, in a tailored black blazer and crisp white shirt. Her natural curls were pulled back neatly, her expression unreadable. As they entered the courtroom, the room fell silent. Judge Marissa Caldwell, a no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s known for her fair but firm rulings, looked up from her bench. She frowned, looking between the officer and the woman. "Officer Marshall, who is this?" Ted scoffed and rolled his eyes as if the answer was obvious. "Caught her loitering near a jewelry store after hours. She looked suspicious, refused to give me her ID. Probably scoping out the place to rob it. You know how these types are, Your Honor." Judge Caldwell's frown deepened. "These types?" she repeated, her tone icy. "Be careful with your language, Officer Marshall." Ted chuckled, shrugging off her warning. "I'm just saying, Your Honor. You know what I mean. Always looking for trouble." Before the judge could respond, the woman raised her hand, her voice calm but firm. "May I speak now?" Judge Caldwell nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Go ahead." The woman stepped forward, pulling out a sleek black leather portfolio from her bag. Her voice rang clear across the silent courtroom. "First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Alexandria James, and I'm not a suspect, Officer Marshall. I'm a federal prosecutor, and I work out of the Northern District Office." She pulled out her federal ID and placed it on the desk in front of the judge. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Ted's smirk vanished instantly, replaced with a look of sheer panic. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Judge Caldwell's eyes widened as she examined the ID, then looked back at Alexandria. "You're a federal prosecutor?" "Yes, Your Honor," Alexandria said, her tone calm but now edged with steel. "And what Officer Marshall just did is not only deeply offensive, but it also amounts to racial profiling and abuse of power." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Ted looked as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. His face went pale, and beads of sweat began forming on his forehead. Alexandria turned to face him, her gaze steady. "I told you who I was, Officer Marshall. I explained that I worked for the federal government, and you dismissed me. You told me I didn't look like a prosecutor. What does a prosecutor look like to you? Because I'd love to know." Ted stammered, trying to find his words, but Alexandria didn't give him the chance. "You pulled me over, accused me of loitering, and arrested me without any probable cause. You racially profiled me, humiliated me in public, and now you've brought me here to make a fool of yourself in front of this entire courtroom." The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Ms. James," she said, her voice calm but authoritative, "I'll need to review the details of this case before making any decisions, but rest assured, this will not go unaddressed." Alexandria nodded and stepped back, her face unreadable. Ted stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly. His world was crashing down around him, and he knew it. It had started like any other day for Alexandria James. She was 35, sharp, and laser-focused on her career. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, she had worked hard to become one of the youngest federal prosecutors in the country. Her mother, a retired schoolteacher, had instilled in her a love for justice and a deep sense of pride in who she was. Her morning routine was simple: coffee, a quick jog along the river, and then off to work. That day, she'd left the house early to prepare for a major case involving a corporate fraud ring. She had no idea that her day would take such a sharp and unexpected turn. While walking back to her car after grabbing a sandwich at a local deli, she noticed Officer Marshall watching her from across the street. At first, she didn't think much of it. People often stared, sometimes because of her striking appearance, and sometimes because of her professional attire in casual settings. But then, he crossed the street. "You," he barked, pointing at her. "What are you doing here?" She stopped in her tracks, confused. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he snapped. "You're loitering. This isn't your neighborhood. You got ID?" Alexandria blinked, trying to process his hostility. "I'm not loitering," she said carefully. "And I don't have to show you my ID without probable cause." He smirked, clearly enjoying the power he thought he had. Probable cause? Well, look who thinks they're a lawyer. "I am a lawyer," she said, her tone steady. "And you're dangerously close to crossing a line here, officer." Her calm demeanor seemed to anger him further. He grabbed her arm, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make a scene. "That's it. You're coming with me." People on the street stopped to watch as Alexandria protested. "This is unnecessary. I'm not resisting, but this is wrong." Ted didn't care. He was too caught up in his own biases and assumptions to listen. And now, as she stood in the courtroom, confronting him in front of a judge and an audience, the full weight of his actions was crashing down on him. But this was just the beginning of Alexandria's fight, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been underestimated or mistreated because of the color of their skin. The courtroom was still silent as Judge Caldwell called for a recess, leaving everyone wondering, what would happen next? Would justice truly be served, or would the system once again fail to hold someone accountable for their abuse of power? The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Judge Caldwell, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in her wake. Officer Ted Marshall stood frozen, his face pale, sweat dripping down his temples. Alexandria James remained calm, her arms crossed as she watched him squirm. The gallery, filled with a mix of reporters, spectators, and attorneys, whispered amongst themselves, their murmurs carrying a mix of shock and curiosity. Ted finally managed to find his voice, though it cracked under the weight of his panic. "Listen, this is all a big misunderstanding," he stammered, addressing Alexandria directly. "I didn't know you were a prosecutor. You didn't tell me." Her expression didn't waver. "Oh, I told you. Multiple times. You just didn't believe me, because I didn't fit your idea of what a prosecutor should look like. Isn't that right, Officer Marshall?" The tension in the room was palpable, and Alexandria's sharp words cut through it like a blade. Ted opened his mouth to respond, but the courtroom clerk interrupted. "Ms. James, Judge Caldwell has requested a brief recess to review the case files. She'll be back shortly." Alexandria nodded and turned to gather her belongings. Before she could leave the courtroom, a man's voice called out to her. "Excuse me, Ms. James." She turned to see a young black attorney in the back of the room. He looked to be in his late 20s, his suit slightly wrinkled, his tie just a little off-center. He held a notebook and a pen, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. "I'm Brandon Hayes," he said, stepping forward nervously. "I'm an associate at Harris & Cole. I just wanted to say, what you're doing here is incredible. A lot of us don't get the chance to stand up to this kind of thing." Alexandria softened slightly, offering a small smile. "Thank you, Brandon. But this isn't just about me. It's about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter who they are." He nodded fervently. "If there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, please let me know." She appreciated the sentiment but knew this wasn't the time for alliances or distractions. "I'll keep that in mind," she said politely before heading out into the hallway. Ted Marshall had woken up in a foul mood. His wife, tired of his late nights and surly demeanor, had slept in the guest room again. His teenage daughter barely spoke to him anymore, and his fellow officers at the precinct didn't respect him the way they used to. Ted's frustration wasn't just about his personal life. It was about control. He'd always believed that respect was earned through authority and intimidation. But lately, the world felt like it was changing too fast, slipping out of his grip. When he saw Alexandria walking down the street that morning, something about her calm confidence irritated him. She was walking like she owned the place, like she didn't care what anyone thought of her. It triggered something ugly in him, something he couldn't quite articulate but acted on instinctively. She was black, She was successful looking, and in his mind, she didn't belong there. So he acted, without thought, without reason, without realizing how profoundly he was about to screw up his life. When the court reconvened, the energy in the room was electric. Judge Caldwell entered with an expression that gave nothing away. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly at Alexandria. "Ms. James, I've reviewed the preliminary details of this case. If you'd like to proceed with a formal complaint against Officer Marshall, I can arrange for an internal affairs investigator to take your statement." Ted's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Your Honor, that's not necessary. I'm sure we can handle this without." "Sit down, Officer Marshall," Judge Caldwell snapped, her voice cutting through his protest. "You are not in control here. Not anymore." Ted sat down, visibly shaken. His arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by fear and desperation. He glanced at Alexandria, but she didn't so much as flinch under his gaze. Alexandria stood, her voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, I intend to file a formal complaint. What happened today isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who have been mistreated, underestimated, or targeted because of their race. If this officer isn't held accountable, it sends a message that this behavior is acceptable. And it's not." The room erupted into murmurs again. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and a few cameras flashed as Alexandria's words resonated through the crowd. Judge Caldwell nodded, her expression firm. "Very well. We'll proceed with the necessary steps. Officer Marshall, you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending an investigation." Ted looked as though the air had been sucked out of his lungs. "Administrative leave," he croaked. "But this is non-negotiable," the judge said curtly. "Your actions today have serious consequences, and they will be thoroughly investigated." As Alexandria left the courthouse, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. She'd taken a stand, but she knew this was just the beginning. Ted Marshall wasn't just an individual problem. He was part of a larger system that allowed men like him to abuse their power without fear of consequences. The battle ahead would be long, and she wasn't naive about the challenges she'd face. Outside the courthouse, a group of reporters swarmed her, shouting questions. "Ms. James, do you believe Officer Marshall's actions were racially motivated? Will you be seeking further legal action? What message do you hope this sends to other officers in similar positions?" She held up a hand, her voice calm but firm. "I'll address all questions at a later time. Right now, my focus is ensuring that justice is served." Brandon Hayes appeared again, this time standing off to the side, watching her with admiration. He didn't approach this time, but Alexandria caught his eye and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. As she walked to her car, she replayed the events of the day in her mind. Ted's face when she revealed her identity, the murmurs in the courtroom, the judge's firm words. It was all satisfying, but it also reminded her of the responsibility she now carried. This wasn't just about her career or her pride. It was about dismantling the prejudices and abuses of power that had plagued her community for generations. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and took a deep breath. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Alexandria drove away, Ted sat alone in the courtroom, his career dangling by a thread. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "We've got a problem," he said into the receiver, his voice trembling. "A big one." Ted Marshall sat in his car, parked outside a desolate diner off the highway. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had never felt this kind of pressure before. Not from his bosses, not from his wife, and certainly not from a courtroom. His reputation, his job, and everything he'd worked for were teetering on the edge of collapse. Worse yet, he knew deep down that he had no one to blame but himself. But admitting that wasn't in his nature. He glanced at his phone. Its screen lit up with a call from his union rep, Paul Reinhardt. Ted sighed heavily and answered. "Paul," he muttered. "Ted, what the hell happened today? I've got reporters calling the station, asking for a statement about you racially profiling a federal prosecutor." "A prosecutor, Ted? Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" Ted rubbed his temple, already annoyed by the lecturing tone. "It was a mistake. I didn't know who she was." That's the problem, Paul snapped. You didn't know, but you acted like you did. You've put us all in a mess, Ted. They're already opening an internal investigation, and the DA's office is getting involved. Ted's stomach dropped. The DA? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, the DA. They're pissed. They want to make an example out of this. Look, I'm going to do what I can to minimize the fallout, but you need to keep your head down. No interviews, no statements, no contact with anyone involved in the case. Do you hear me? Ted clenched his jaw, the shame and anger bubbling inside him. I hear you. Paul's voice softened slightly. Look, Ted, you've been on the force for 20 years. You've got a lot of people rooting for you, but you've got to help yourself here. This isn't the time to play the tough guy. Let me handle the politics. You just stay quiet. The call ended, leaving Ted alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his seat and stared out the windshield. A part of him wanted to believe this would all blow over, that it was just a bad day in a long career. But deep down, he knew this wasn't going away. Not this time. The following morning, Alexandria James sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee as she reviewed the news coverage of the previous day's events. Her face was plastered across every major outlet, accompanied by headlines like, Prosecutor faces racial profiling by veteran officer, and Justice for Alexandria James sparks debate on police bias. She'd been in the public eye before, but not like this. This wasn't about a case or a legal victory. This was personal. She felt the weight of the attention pressing down on her shoulders, but she reminded herself why she was doing this. It wasn't just about holding Ted Marshall accountable. It was about sending a message. Her phone buzzed with a text from her boss, U.S. Attorney Diane Willows. We need to talk. Come in at 9. Alexandria sighed and glanced at the clock. It was 8:15. She quickly finished her coffee, grabbed her briefcase, and headed out the door. The office was buzzing with energy when Alexandria arrived. Colleagues who usually greeted her with casual smiles now gave her wide-eyed looks of admiration or quiet nods of support. She tried to ignore the attention as she made her way to Diane's office. Diane was a formidable woman in her early 60s, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and an air of authority that could silence a room. She looked up from her desk as Alexandria entered, motioning for her to sit. Alex, Diane began, folding her hands on the desk. I saw the footage. I read the reports. What you did yesterday was remarkable. Alexandria raised an eyebrow. Remarkable? I didn't feel remarkable. I felt tired. Diane offered a small smile. I can imagine. But you handled yourself with grace and dignity in a situation that could have gone 100 different ways. That said, I need to know what your plan is moving forward. Alexandria frowned. My plan? Yes, Diane said, leaning forward. This is bigger than you now. The media is involved, public opinion is forming, and people are looking to you for leadership. Whether you like it or not, this is a movement. So, are you ready for that? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Alexandria took a deep breath. I didn't ask for any of this, Diane. I just want to do my job. Diane nodded. I know, but sometimes the job chooses you. Think about it, Alex. Whatever you decide, we've got your back. Meanwhile, Ted couldn't escape the storm brewing around him. News vans were parked outside his home, and neighbors were whispering behind closed doors. He had become a pariah overnight, and it was only getting worse. Desperate to vent his frustration, Ted met with his closest ally on the force, Sergeant Luke Bryant. They sat in the back corner of a small dive bar, nursing beers as they talked in hushed tones. She's trying to ruin me, Luke, Ted said, his voice low and bitter. All because I made one mistake. Luke raised an eyebrow. One mistake? Ted, you dragged a federal prosecutor into court and accused her of loitering. That's not just a mistake. It's a career-ending screw-up. Ted glared at him. Whose side are you on? Luke sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, man, I'm on your side. But you need to face facts. This isn't going away unless you do something about it. What am I supposed to do? Ted asked, frustration lacing his words. Apologize. Admit I was wrong. That'll just make me look weak. Luke leaned in, his expression serious. No, you need to fight back. If this turns into a public trial, you're finished. You've got to discredit her. Find something, anything, that makes her look bad. Ted hesitated, the idea gnawing at him. He knew it was a slippery slope, but he was running out of options. And if I don't, then you'd better start thinking about life after the badge, Luke said bluntly. Ted stared into his beer, his mind racing. The idea of digging into Alexandria's past felt wrong, but his fear of losing everything outweighed his conscience. That night, Alexandria sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through her phone. She'd received hundreds of messages, some supportive, others hateful. One in particular caught her attention. It was an anonymous email with the subject line, "Watch your back." The message was short but chilling. You don't know who you're messing with. Drop the complaint, or you'll regret it. Alexandria's stomach churned as she read the words. She immediately forwarded the email to her IT department at the office, but the unease lingered. This wasn't just about Ted Marshall anymore. Someone else was getting involved. Someone who didn't want her to see this fight through. As she closed her laptop and turned off the lights, a feeling of dread settled over her. She had no idea how far the opposition was willing to go. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. Alexandria barely slept that night, her mind replaying the events of the day and the chilling email she'd received. She was no stranger to threats. Her work as a federal prosecutor had earned her more than a few enemies, but this felt different. It wasn't a petty criminal or a desperate defendant trying to intimidate her. This was someone calculated, someone determined to silence her. By morning, she was exhausted but resolute. She forwarded the email again, this time to her boss, Diane, with a note. We need to talk about this. Then she got dressed, ready to tackle another day head-on. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. Not now, not ever. Meanwhile, Ted sat in his home office, staring at a folder Luke had dropped off late the previous night. It was filled with pages of information about Alexandria, her career history, cases she'd worked on, even her personal life. Ted hesitated before opening it. He wasn't proud of what he was about to do, but he was desperate to save his own skin. He flipped through the pages, looking for anything he could use against her. But as he read, he found himself growing more frustrated. Alexandria's record was spotless. She was a star prosecutor with a reputation for integrity and fairness. There were no skeletons in her closet, no missteps or scandals to exploit. Just as he was about to give up, he found a single detail that caught his attention, a dismissed case from her early career. It wasn't much, but it was something. He made a note to dig deeper, hoping it might be the lifeline he needed. At the federal courthouse, Alexandria met with Diane in her corner office. Diane was already reviewing the email when Alexandria walked in. "This is serious," Diane said, her tone grave. "Whoever sent this isn't just blowing off steam. They're trying to scare you into backing down." Alexandria nodded. "I forwarded it to IT. Hopefully, they can trace the source." Diane leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This case is stirring up a lot of emotions. You've become a symbol, Alex. People see you as a challenge to the status quo, and that makes you a threat." "I'm not trying to be a symbol," Alexandria said quietly. "I just want justice." Diane smiled faintly. "I know, but sometimes justice comes with a spotlight. The question is, are you ready for what comes next?" Alexandria didn't hesitate. "I am." Diane nodded. "Good. Because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about the message we're sending to everyone who's been in your position." Ted, on the other hand, was spiraling. He'd spent the morning at the precinct, where his colleagues had either avoided him entirely or offered half-hearted reassurances. The weight of the investigation was crushing him, and he felt more isolated than ever. Luke called him later that afternoon, his tone urgent. "Ted, I've got something. Meet me at the diner in 20. When Ted arrived, Luke slid a manila envelope across the table. I pulled some strings and got a copy of her personnel file from when she worked in Atlanta. Turns out she had a case dismissed early in her career. Something about mishandled evidence." Ted's eyes lit up. "Mishandled evidence? That's perfect. If we can show she's not as perfect as she pretends to be, it could shift the narrative." Luke hesitated. "Ted, You need to be careful. If this backfires, it could make things worse. Ted ignored the warning, already planning his next move. It won't backfire. This is exactly what I need. That evening, Alexandria attended a community forum on police reform. She'd been invited as a guest speaker, and despite her exhaustion, she felt compelled to go. The room was packed with people from all walks of life: activists, attorneys, victims of police misconduct, and concerned citizens. When it was her turn to speak, Alexandria stepped up to the microphone, her heart pounding. She wasn't used to speaking in such a personal way, but she knew this was bigger than her comfort zone. I'm here today because I believe in accountability, she began, her voice steady. Not just for police officers, but for all of us. We have a responsibility to stand up when we see injustice, to call out prejudice and abuse of power. What happened to me is just one example of a much larger problem. And if we don't address it, we're complicit in allowing it to continue. The room erupted into applause. Alexandria took a deep breath, her confidence growing. She spent the next 15 minutes sharing her story and listening to others, finding strength in the solidarity of the crowd. As the event wrapped up, a man approached her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked vaguely familiar. "Ms. James," he said, his tone polite but firm. "A word." She hesitated, unsure of his intentions. "Do I know you?" "No, ma'am," he said. "But I know you. And I know the man you're up against." Her heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Let's just say I used to work with him. And if you think what happened to you is bad, you don't know the half of it." Alexandria stared at him, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" The man looked over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. "Officer Marshall has a history. This isn't the first time he's crossed the line, but the department's covered for him every time. If you're serious about taking him down, I can help." Alexandria's pulse quickened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone needs to stop him," the man said simply. "And you might be the only one who can." Before she could ask more, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Alexandria stood there, her mind spinning. If what he said was true, this was bigger than she'd imagined. Ted Marshall wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symptom of a corrupt system. She knew what she had to do. But as she headed home that night, the anonymous email replayed in her mind. "Watch your back." The stakes were higher than ever, and she was walking a dangerous path. But there was no turning back now. Alexandria sat in her car in the dark parking lot outside her apartment, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The conversation at the community forum replayed in her mind like a broken record. Who was that man? And how did he know so much about Ted Marshall? His words, cryptic as they were, made one thing clear. There was more to this case than she initially realized. She looked at her phone. The temptation to call Diane and tell her everything was strong, but something about the man's warning nagged at her. If Ted Marshall's history was as bad as the man implied, then her next steps needed to be calculated. Every move mattered now. She inhaled deeply and stepped out of the car, scanning her surroundings before heading inside. Inside her apartment, Alexandria opened her laptop and started digging. She had access to records that most people couldn't dream of seeing, and if there was dirt on Ted Marshall, she was determined to find it. She began by looking into his personnel file. Public complaints, internal investigations, settlements. She sifted through everything she could find. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge. Complaints of excessive force, allegations of racial profiling, and one incident buried in a sealed file that caught her attention. A 19-year-old black man who had been hospitalized after a routine stop with Ted nearly 10 years ago. The file was redacted heavily, but the outline of the story was there. The man, Jamal Price, had claimed Ted beat him unnecessarily, but the case had been dismissed after the department ruled there wasn't enough evidence. Alexandria's chest tightened. Jamal Price's name wasn't one she'd heard before, but his story mirrored far too many others. She made a note to find him, hoping he could shed light on what happened. But then there was something else, something even more troubling. Another name appeared multiple times in Ted's records: Luke Bryant, the same man Ted had been seen with at the precinct and at the diner. Luke had signed off on several of the internal investigations involving Ted, each time clearing him of wrongdoing. It was clear they were close. Too close. And if Luke was helping Ted cover his tracks, Alexandria knew she'd need more than just Jamal's story to expose them. The next morning, Ted was already up and pacing his living room when Luke arrived. He'd called Luke the moment Alexandria's face appeared on the morning news again. The headline was a damning one. Prosecutor speaks out. Officer Marshall faces new scrutiny amid racial profiling claims. Ted's face was red with frustration as he waved the remote at the TV. Did you see this? She's not backing down, Luke. She's turning the whole world against me. Luke leaned against the doorframe, unbothered. You need to calm down, Ted. Panicking won't help. Calm down. You think I can calm down when my career is hanging by a thread? Ted snapped. You're supposed to have my back. Luke sighed. I do have your back. That's why I'm here. But you've got to start thinking smart. You're in a bad position, and every move you make now is critical. Ted collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. She's too good. Her record's clean. I can't find anything to use against her. Luke frowned, considering his words carefully. Then you need to change the game. She's painting you as a racist, Ted. If you want to survive this, you've got to flip the narrative. Ted looked up, desperation in his eyes. How? Luke leaned in, his voice low. You can't just defend yourself anymore. You've got to go on the offensive. Make people question her motives. Paint her as someone who's out to destroy good cops for her own gain. Ted hesitated, his stomach twisting at the thought. But Luke's words, as manipulative as they were, made sense. He didn't have much left to lose. Alexandria spent most of the day tracking down Jamal Price. After hours of phone calls and dead ends, she finally got a lead. Jamal was living in a small apartment on Chicago's South Side. She called his number, leaving a voicemail explaining who she was and why she wanted to talk to him. Then she waited. The call came later that evening. This is Jamal Price. You said you wanted to talk to me. His voice was wary, guarded. Alexandria didn't blame him. Yes, Mr. Price. My name is Alexandria James. I'm a federal prosecutor, and I've been looking into Ted Marshall. I saw your name in some of his records, and I was hoping you'd be willing to share your story with me. Jamal was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was hard. Why now? That man ruined my life, and no one cared back then. What makes you think anyone cares now? Alexandria's throat tightened. I care, and I know it won't change what happened to you. But if you help me, we might be able to stop him from doing this to anyone else. Another long pause. Finally, Jamal sighed. Fine, I'll talk, but not over the phone. Meet me tomorrow at 3 p.m. There's a diner on 47th and King. You know it? I'll be there, Alexandria promised. As Alexandria prepared for her meeting with Jamal, Ted was busy executing Luke's plan. With Luke's help, he crafted a statement claiming that Alexandria had a personal vendetta against him. The statement, released to the press, accused her of exploiting her position to push an anti-police agenda. Ted even threw in a fabricated anecdote about a heated exchange with Alexandria during her arrest, painting her as aggressive and unprofessional. The response was immediate. Headlines shifted, and social media erupted with arguments on both sides. Ted's supporters latched onto his claims, while Alexandria's defenders dismissed them as desperate lies. The narrative was muddying, just as Luke had hoped. But Alexandria didn't flinch. She knew the truth, and she was determined to let her actions speak louder than Ted's words. The next day, Alexandria arrived at the diner early. She sat in a corner booth, sipping coffee and watching the door. At exactly 3 p.m., Jamal walked in. He was taller than she expected, with a quiet intensity in his eyes that spoke of years of pain and resilience. Ms. James, he asked, sliding into the booth across from her. Call me Alexandria, she said, offering a warm smile. Jamal nodded, but his expression remained serious. You said you wanted to know about Ted Marshall. What do you want to know? Everything, Alexandria said. I want to know what happened to you, and I want to know why the case was dismissed. Jamal's jaw tightened, and he looked down at his hands. He stopped me for no reason, said I looked suspicious. I tried to explain I was on my way to work, but he wouldn't listen. Next thing I knew, he had me pinned to the ground, calling me all kinds of names. When it was over, I was in the hospital with 3 broken ribs and a concussion. Alexandria felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over her. And the case. Jamal's lips curled into a bitter smile. The department said there wasn't enough evidence. Luke Bryant, his buddy, signed off on the investigation. I tried to fight it, but I didn't have the resources. I lost my job, my apartment, everything. Alexandria's heart ached for him, but she also felt a renewed determination. Jamal, I'm so sorry for what you've been through, but if you're willing to share your story publicly, we might be able to hold him accountable. Jamal hesitated, his eyes searching hers. Finally, he nodded. If it helps take him down, I'll do it. Alexandria reached across the table, placing a hand on his. Thank you. Together, we'll make sure he never does this to anyone else. As they left the diner, neither of them noticed the man sitting at the counter, watching them carefully. He waited until they were gone before pulling out his phone. Yeah, he said into the receiver. We've got a problem. The air felt heavy as Alexandria returned home from her meeting with Jamal. She had expected his story to be harrowing, but the raw pain in his voice had struck a chord deep within her. He was a man who had lost everything to a system designed to protect people like Ted Marshall. And now, she was determined to make sure that his story wasn't buried like so many others. As she sat down to review her notes, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Diane. Call me as soon as you get this. Alexandria sighed and dialed the number. Diane picked up on the first ring. Alex, I need you to hear this from me before you see it anywhere else, Diane said, her voice tight. Ted Marshall's lawyer just issued a statement accusing you of misconduct during your arrest. Alexandria's heart sank. What kind of misconduct? They're claiming you were combative and uncooperative. They're trying to paint you as an angry black woman who lashed out because you were being held accountable. Alexandria clenched her fists. That's a blatant lie. I didn't resist. I told him exactly who I was, and he ignored me. I know, Diane said, but they're using the court of public opinion to shift the narrative. The media is already picking it up, and the usual voices are jumping in to discredit you. Alexandria's pulse quickened as anger surged through her. Let them say what they want. I have the truth on my side. You do, Diane agreed, but the truth isn't always enough. We need to stay ahead of this. Do you have anything concrete we can use against him? Alexandria thought of Jamal and the story he'd shared with her earlier that day. I do, she said. There's a man who's willing to come forward. Ted assaulted him years ago, and the case was buried by his department. Diane paused. That could be huge. But Alex, you need to be careful. If you bring this man into the spotlight, Ted's people will come after him. You know how dirty they'll play. I'll protect him, Alexandria said firmly. We'll protect him. Diane sighed. Okay, I trust you. But tread carefully, Alex. This isn't just a legal battle anymore. It's a war. Meanwhile, Ted sat in Luke's garage, nursing a beer as Luke laid out their plan. The garage was cluttered with old police memorabilia and half-empty boxes, a fitting backdrop for their clandestine meeting. Here's the thing, Luke said, pacing back and forth. The public doesn't care about nuance. They don't care about facts. They care about perception. Right now, Alexandria James is the hero, and you're the villain. We need to flip that. Ted leaned back in his chair, scowling. And how do we do that? Luke smirked. Simple. We discredit her, and anyone who supports her. You said she's working with someone, right? A witness. Ted nodded. Yeah, some guy she's meeting with. I don't know his name. Doesn't matter, Luke said. We'll find him. And when we do, we'll make sure his credibility is shot before he even opens his mouth. Ted hesitated. And if she comes after us with more evidence? Luke's smile faded, his tone turning cold. Then we hit her where it hurts. Everyone's got skeletons in their closet. We just have to find hers. Ted nodded, the weight of his desperation blinding him to the moral abyss he was stepping into. The next morning, Alexandria met with Jamal at her office to prepare him for what was coming. He sat across from her desk, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Despite his nervousness, there was a quiet resolve in his eyes. "I'm not going to lie to you, Jamal," Alexandria said. "This isn't going to be easy. Ted and his people are going to try to discredit you. They'll dig into your past, twist your words, whatever it takes to protect him." "I know," Jamal said, "but I'm tired of staying silent. He took so much from me, and no one ever held him accountable. If coming forward helps stop him, then it's worth it." Alexandria nodded, her respect for him growing by the minute. "Thank you. Your bravery means more than you know." As they talked, Alexandria's assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. James, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Alexandria frowned. "Who is it?" "He wouldn't give his name," her assistant said, looking uneasy. "But he said he used to work with Ted Marshall." Alexandria exchanged a glance with Jamal before nodding. "Send him in." A moment later, the man from the community forum stepped into her office. Up close, she could see the lines of stress etched into his face and the cautious way he moved, as if expecting trouble to follow him. "Ms. James," he said, his voice low. "I told you before. I know what kind of man Ted Marshall is. I came here today to prove it." He handed her a thick envelope. Inside were pages of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. Alexandria's breath caught as she realized what she was holding. "These are internal reports," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get these?" The man hesitated. "Let's just say I kept copies of things I wasn't supposed to. I couldn't live with what I saw." Alexandria flipped through the pages, her shock turning to fury. The documents detailed years of misconduct, cover-ups, and abuses of power by Ted and his allies. There were reports of excessive force, falsified evidence, and even incidents of intimidation against witnesses. This is a goldmine," Alexandria said, her voice shaking. "Thank you." The man nodded. "Use it wisely. Ted's dangerous, and so are the people protecting him. If they find out I gave you this, they'll come for me." Alexandria met his gaze, her expression firm. "I'll protect you. All of you." But even as she said the words, she felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She had the evidence she needed to expose Ted, but she also knew the risks. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop anymore. It was about an entire system that would fight tooth and nail to protect itself. As the man left, Alexandria turned to Jamal. "This changes everything," she said. "But it also raises the stakes." Jamal nodded, his face set with determination. "Then we'd better be ready." Little did they know, outside the building, a car sat idling with tinted windows. Inside, a man with a camera snapped photos of the two as they talked through the office window. He sent the pictures to Ted with a simple message. "They're moving fast. What's the plan?" Ted's reply came seconds later. "Stop them. Whatever it takes." Alexandria was reviewing the evidence in her office when her phone buzzed on the desk. It was Diane. The urgency in her boss's tone was unmistakable. "Alex, I just got off the phone with the IT department. That anonymous email you forwarded to us. They traced it back to a private server. It's unregistered, likely a burner account." Diane paused. "But it gets worse. Whoever sent it has been tracking your movements." Alexandria froze, gripping the phone tighter. "Tracking me? How?" "They must have someone following you. They've accessed your public schedules and cross-referenced them with recent appearances. I don't know how deep this goes. But Alex, you need to be careful." The warning sent a chill through her. "Do we know who's behind it?" "Not yet, but we're working on it. In the meantime, keep a low profile. No unnecessary risks." Alexandria sighed. Keeping a low profile was easier said than done, especially now that she had a trove of evidence that could bring down not just Ted, but an entire network of corrupt officers. The weight of responsibility pressed on her like a boulder. Meanwhile, Ted sat in a dimly lit room with Luke and two other officers he trusted, if trust was even the right word. They huddled around a table cluttered with papers, photos, and a laptop displaying surveillance footage. "Alexandria James is making her move," Luke said, pointing to a grainy photo of her leaving the diner with Jamal. "She's got this guy, Jamal Price, and she's digging into your past. We got to act fast." Ted slammed his fist on the table. I'm sick of her making me look like the bad guy. This is my career on the line. Luke leaned back, his expression calm but calculating. You want to stop her? Then we need to play hardball. Hit her where she doesn't expect it. Ted glared at him. And what does that mean? Luke smirked. We use her own strength against her. People see her as this perfect prosecutor, this symbol of justice. All we have to do is plant a seed of doubt. If we make her look compromised, even just a little, it'll be enough to shift public opinion. How do we do that? One of the other officers asked. Luke pulled out a USB drive and slid it across the table to Ted. On there is everything we need. Old cases where she was involved, dismissed complaints, even rumors. It doesn't matter if it's true. It just needs to sound plausible. Once we leak this, the media will eat it up. Ted stared at the drive, the weight of his choices hanging over him. He knew he was crossing a line, but at this point, his desperation outweighed his morality. Let's do it, he said finally. Luke grinned. Good. Now let's make sure she regrets ever coming after you. The following day, Alexandria was preparing for her press conference. With the evidence Jamal and the unnamed whistleblower had provided, she felt more confident than ever. This wasn't just a case against Ted Marshall. It was a chance to expose systemic corruption. As she reviewed her speech, her phone buzzed with a news alert. She opened it, and her stomach dropped. The headline read, Federal Prosecutor Under Fire. Allegations of misconduct surface amid controversy. Alexandria clicked on the article, her heart pounding. It was filled with vague accusations and baseless claims about her career. Old cases where she had made tough calls were twisted to make her look biased. Anonymous sources accused her of using her position for personal gain. It was a smear campaign, and it was working. The comments section was a minefield of vitriol. People questioned her integrity, her motives, even her ability to do her job. Alexandria felt a wave of frustration and anger. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was Ted and his allies fighting back. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Diane. Alex, have you seen it? Yes, Alexandria said through gritted teeth. It's a coordinated attack. They're trying to discredit me. Of course they are, Diane said. But we knew this was coming. The question is, how are you going to respond? Alexandria leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. We stick to the truth. We present the evidence. Let them throw MUD. That IT won't stick if we have the facts. Diane paused. That's a good plan, Alex. But you need to be ready. This won't stop here. They're going to come at you harder. I can handle it, Alexandria said, though the knot in her stomach told her otherwise. Later that evening, Alexandria met with Jamal and the whistleblower in a secure location. She laid out the plan for the press conference, emphasizing the importance of staying calm and focused. This is about more than just Ted Marshall, she said. It's about exposing a culture of corruption. They're going to come after us. But if we stand together, we can't be silenced. Jamal nodded, his resolve unwavering. I'm ready. The whistleblower, however, looked uneasy. Are you sure about this? Once we go public, there's no turning back. They'll come after all of us. Alexandria met his gaze. I know. But if we don't do this, they'll keep getting away with it. This is our chance to make a difference. The man hesitated, then nodded. All right. I'm in. The next morning, Alexandria stood at the podium in a packed press room. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled for position, and the tension was palpable. Behind her, Jamal and the whistleblower sat, their faces solemn but determined. Alexandria took a deep breath and began. Thank you all for being here. Today, we're here to talk about accountability, integrity, and justice. For too long, individuals like Ted Marshall have abused their power, and the systems meant to hold them accountable have failed. She went on to outline the evidence they had gathered, presenting the documents and testimonies that exposed years of misconduct and cover-ups. The room buzzed with energy as the reporters scrambled to take notes and ask questions. But just as Alexandria was finishing her speech, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "You've gone too far. You won't see the end of this." Alexandria's stomach churned, but she refused to let fear show on her face. She finished her statement, her voice steady and strong. We will not be intimidated. We will not be silenced. Justice will prevail. As she stepped away from the podium, the weight of the text lingered in her mind. She had drawn a line in the sand, and now it was clear. Her enemies were willing to do whatever it took to stop her. Across town, Ted sat in a dimly lit office, watching the press conference on TV. He clenched his fists as Alexandria's words echoed in his ears. Luke stood behind him, his face cold and calculating. She's got the public on her side now, Ted muttered. What do we do? Luke's expression darkened. We take this to the next level. If she wants a fight, we'll give her one she'll never forget. Ted looked at him, the weight of his desperation evident in his eyes. Whatever it takes. Luke nodded, his tone chilling. Whatever it takes. The streets were quiet as Alexandria drove home that evening. The press conference had been a resounding success, at least on the surface. Reporters had been captivated by the evidence she'd presented, and social media was alight with messages of support. But the anonymous text still lingered in her mind, a reminder that her fight was far from over. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something strange. The street light outside her home, which usually cast a warm glow over her yard, was out. The area was darker than usual, and her instincts immediately went on high alert. She parked and sat in the car for a moment, scanning her surroundings. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease gnawed at her. Alexandria stepped out of the car, her briefcase in one hand and her keys in the other. She reached the front door and was about to unlock it when she noticed it. A faint scratch on the doorknob, like someone had tampered with it. Her pulse quickened. She turned and hurried back to her car, dialing Diane as she slid into the driver's seat. Diane, I think someone's been in my house, she said, her voice trembling but controlled. What? Are you sure? Diane asked, concern lacing her voice. There's a scratch on my doorknob, and the street light outside is out. It doesn't feel right. Get out of there, Alex. Go somewhere safe. I'll send someone to check it out. Alexandria nodded, already starting the engine. She pulled away from the curb, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. A dark SUV followed her at a distance, its headlights dimmed. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She took a sharp turn, then another, trying to lose the vehicle, but it stayed with her. She wasn't imagining it. She was being followed. Meanwhile, Ted sat in Luke's office, his anxiety mounting. The smear campaign against Alexandria had gained some traction, but her press conference had shifted the momentum back in her favor. The evidence she presented was damning, and Ted knew it was only a matter of time before the investigation turned up even more. Luke leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. She's got the public on her side now, he said. That press conference was a power move. She's making you look like a relic of everything wrong with the system. Ted rubbed his temples, the stress threatening to overwhelm him. What do we do? If she keeps this up, I'm done. Luke's eyes narrowed. We escalate. She wants to play the hero. Fine. Let's make her the villain. Ted looked at him warily. What does that mean? Luke smirked, his voice calm but chilling. We dig deeper. We make her life so difficult, so chaotic, that she has no choice but to back down. Everyone's got weaknesses. We just have to find hers. Alexandria drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, the SUV tailing her the entire time. She tried everything, quick turns, sudden stops, even ducking into a gas station parking lot, but the vehicle remained close. Finally, she decided to test her theory. She pulled into the lot of a well-lit 24-hour diner and parked near the entrance. She stepped out of the car, keeping her phone in her hand. As she walked toward the diner, the SUV stopped at the edge of the lot, its engine idling. Alexandria's heart pounded as she reached the door and turned, pretending to take a call while glancing at the vehicle. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He lingered near the SUV, as if debating whether to approach. Alexandria didn't wait to find out. She stepped inside the diner and walked straight to the counter, where the waitress greeted her with a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" the waitress asked. Alexandria leaned in, keeping her voice low. "I'm being followed." Can you call the police? The waitress's eyes widened, but she nodded quickly. Of course. Are you okay? I will be, Alexandria said, glancing out the window. The man had gotten back into the SUV, but the vehicle hadn't moved. It sat there, a silent threat. Minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. The SUV peeled out immediately, tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. Alexandria let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through her as the officers entered the diner. The next morning, Alexandria met with Jamal and the whistleblower in her office. Both men looked tense, their nerves frayed from the pressure of the situation. Alexandria filled them in on what had happened the night before, her tone steady despite the fear that still lingered. They're trying to scare us, she said, but we can't let them win. Jamal frowned. They're not just trying to scare us. They're trying to silence us. The whistleblower nodded. He's right. I've seen what Ted and his people are capable of. If they feel cornered, they'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Alexandria looked at them, her resolve hardening. Then we need to hit them first. Hard. We have the evidence. We have the truth. It's time to bring this to the next level. Across town, Ted was unraveling. The pressure was mounting, and every move Alexandria made pushed him closer to the edge. Luke tried to calm him, but even he could see that Ted was losing his grip. Look, Luke said, pouring himself a drink. We've got one play left. If she's not going to back down, we need to take her out of the game entirely. Ted stared at him, his expression conflicted. You mean? Luke nodded, his tone deadly serious. A scandal. Something big. Something that'll destroy her credibility for good. Ted hesitated. And if we can't find anything? Luke leaned in, his eyes cold. Then we create something. Later that night, Alexandria received another anonymous text. This one was more direct. You're in over your head. Back down, or we'll make you regret it. She stared at the message, her jaw tightening. Her fear was quickly being replaced by anger. They wanted her to be afraid. They wanted her to stop. But she wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. As she deleted the message, she thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The years of hard work, the sacrifices, the countless people who had been silenced by the system. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for them. But as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, a new realization dawned on her. The people she was up against weren't just going to smear her name or threaten her. They were going to come after her with everything they had. And she had to be ready. Alexandria's apartment was eerily silent as she paced the living room, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The anonymous threats, the smear campaign, the shadowy SUV, it all pointed to one thing. Whoever was backing Ted Marshall wasn't just trying to protect him. They were trying to destroy her. She glanced at the stack of documents on her coffee table, the evidence she and the whistleblower had collected. It was enough to take Ted down, enough to expose the rot in his department. But it also painted a target on her back, a target she could feel growing larger with every passing day. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Jamal. Alexandria, I just got a call from an unknown number, he said, his voice tense. They told me to keep my mouth shut or things will get ugly. What do I do? Alexandria's jaw clenched. You're not alone in this, Jamal. They're trying to scare you, but we're going to see this through. I promise you that. Jamal sighed on the other end of the line. I'm scared, Alex. I've never been part of something this big before. Fear means you're human, she said softly. But courage is what keeps you moving forward anyway. You've already shown more of it than most people ever do. He was quiet for a moment, then said, All right, I'm still with you. After ending the call, Alexandria sank onto her couch, staring at the ceiling. She knew Jamal's fears were justified. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous this became. But she couldn't afford to let her own fears show, not now, when so many people were counting on her. Across town, Ted Marshall sat in the back booth of a rundown bar, his face a mask of frustration. Luke was seated across from him, a cigar in hand and a whiskey in front of him. 2 other officers from their circle sat nearby, their voices low but serious. Alexandria James is turning into a martyr, Luke said, his tone laced with disgust. She's got the public eating out of her hand. If we don't shut her down now, she's going to bury us." Ted leaned forward, his voice sharp. "What are you suggesting, Luke? Because everything we've done so far has only made her stronger." Luke's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to stop playing defense. We got to hit her where it hurts." Ted hesitated. "You mean?" "Yes," Luke said, leaning in. "Her family, her friends, anyone close to her. If she feels like her fight is putting them at risk, she'll back off." Ted looked uneasy. "That's a line, Luke." Luke shrugged, his expression cold. "You want to win, or you want to keep playing nice?" The room fell silent as Ted weighed his options. He knew Luke's plan was crossing a boundary even he wasn't sure he was comfortable with, but the fear of losing everything pushed him closer to the edge. The following day, Alexandria met with Diane to plan their next steps. The office was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Diane was poring over the whistleblower's documents, her brow furrowed. "This is explosive," Diane said. "If we release this to the public, it won't just take down Ted. It could trigger a full-blown investigation into the department, which is exactly what needs to happen," Alexandria said firmly. Diane nodded. "Agreed. But we need to time this perfectly. If we release it too soon, they'll have time to spin it. Too late, and the momentum you've built might fade." "I'm not worried about timing," Alexandria said. "I'm worried about the people involved. Jamal, the whistleblower. They're putting themselves at serious risk. Then we protect them," Diane said. "But Alex, don't forget to protect yourself too." Alexandria nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She knew the fight wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about survival. That evening, Alexandria decided to clear her head with a walk. The city felt different at night, quieter, almost serene. But tonight it felt foreboding. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound sharper. She tried to shake the feeling, telling herself she was just on edge from everything that had happened. But as she turned the corner onto a quieter street, she felt it. Someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw a figure in the distance, standing under a street lamp. They didn't move, but their presence was unmistakable. Her heart raced as she quickened her pace, her hand slipping into her pocket where her phone was. She turned onto another street, hoping to lose them, but when she glanced back, the figure was still there, closer now. She stopped in her tracks, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. The figure stepped closer, just enough for her to make out the faint outline of their face. It wasn't Ted or Luke. It was someone else entirely, a man she didn't recognize. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he spoke in a calm, deliberate voice. "You need to stop, Miss James. You're in over your head." Alexandria stared at him, her mind racing. "Who sent you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared, leaving her standing there alone on the empty street. Alexandria stood frozen, the man's words echoing in her mind. She wasn't just fighting Ted or his allies anymore. She was up against something much larger, much darker, a machine that would stop at nothing to protect itself. For the first time, she wondered if she'd underestimated just how far they were willing to go. And for the first time, she wondered if they might be right. She was in over her head, but as she turned and walked home, a steely determination settled over her. They might have the power, the resources, the connections, but she had the truth, and she wasn't stopping now. Not when the stakes were this high. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced before her, and she'd rather risk everything than let them win. In the distance, a single car engine roared to life, its sound cutting through the still night like a warning. This wasn't over, and it wasn't going to end quietly. The next morning, Alexandria sat at her desk, staring at the pile of evidence on her table, the events of the previous night still fresh in her mind. The stranger's words played on a loop. "You're in over your head." But instead of deterring her, it strengthened her resolve. If they were going to play dirty, she would respond with the one weapon they couldn't manipulate, the truth. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jamal. "We still on for the meeting?" "Yes," she replied quickly. "Be careful. They're watching us. Alexandria had arranged for Jamal to speak to a trusted journalist, someone she knew wouldn't twist his words or sensationalize the story. The plan was to release Jamal's testimony alongside the whistleblower's documents, creating an undeniable case against Ted and his allies. But as the time for the meeting approached, a sense of dread crept over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Ted sat in his car outside Luke's office, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Luke had been on edge all morning, pacing the room as he barked orders into his phone. The plan was escalating, spiraling into dangerous territory. "Everything's in place," Luke said as he climbed into the passenger seat. "Jamal Price won't make it to that meeting." Ted froze, his stomach churning. "What does that mean, Luke?" "It means we've got someone on him," Luke said bluntly. "He's a loose end we can't afford. If we scare him enough, he'll disappear." Problem solved. Ted's mouth went dry. "Scare him how?" Luke shot him a look. "Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to." For a moment, Ted considered calling it all off. But the thought of losing everything, the badge, the career, the respect, kept him silent. He nodded, his face pale. "Just make sure it doesn't get out of hand." Luke smirked. "Relax. It's just a little persuasion." Jamal arrived at the meeting spot, a small coffee shop in the heart of the city. With a cautious optimism, he spotted Alexandria sitting in the corner, her laptop open, and made his way over. "You made it," Alexandria said with a relieved smile. "Of course," Jamal replied, taking a seat. "I told you I'm in this with you." Before they could dive into the details, the journalist arrived, a middle-aged woman with a sharp demeanor and an air of professionalism. She introduced herself as Karen Holloway, setting up her recording equipment as they exchanged pleasantries. "All right, Jamal," Karen said, her voice calm and encouraging. "Whenever you're ready, tell me your story." Jamal glanced at Alexandria, who nodded reassuringly. He took a deep breath and began. He spoke about the night Ted Marshall had stopped him, the unwarranted accusations, the brutal assault, and the months of pain and humiliation that followed. His voice was steady but laced with emotion, and Karen listened intently, occasionally prompting him with questions. As Jamal recounted the incident, Alexandria kept an eye on the coffee shop entrance. She didn't know what she was expecting, but her instincts told her to stay alert. And then she saw him. A man in a dark hoodie stood outside the window, staring directly at their table. Alexandria's heart skipped a beat as the man pulled out his phone and snapped a picture before walking away. She didn't recognize him, but his presence was unmistakably deliberate. "Jamal," she interrupted gently, "we need to wrap this up." Karen frowned. "Is everything all right?" "No," Alexandria said firmly. "I think we've been made. We need to leave." Karen quickly packed up her equipment, while Jamal looked around nervously. "What do you mean, mate? Are they here?" "I don't know," Alexandria said, glancing out the window again. The man was gone, but her unease remained. "Let's not wait to find out." As they exited the coffee shop, Alexandria led Jamal and Karen to her car. She scanned the street, her nerves on edge, but everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. "Get in," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're not taking any chances." They drove in silence, Alexandria's eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. She took several detours, weaving through side streets to ensure they weren't being followed. Jamal sat in the passenger seat, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, while Karen typed notes on her laptop in the back seat. Finally, they arrived at Alexandria's office building. "This is the safest place I can think of right now," she said. "We'll finish everything here." But as they walked toward the entrance, a black car screeched to a stop across the street. Two men stepped out, their movements hurried and purposeful. Alexandria's heart raced as she realized what was happening. "Run!" she shouted, grabbing Jamal's arm and pulling him toward the door. Karen trailed behind, clutching her laptop as the men began to close the distance. Alexandria fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling, but managed to unlock the door just as the men reached the sidewalk. They slammed the door shut and locked it, the men pounding on the glass. One of them pulled out his phone, snapping more pictures before retreating to the car. Alexandria watched as the vehicle sped away, her chest heaving with the effort to catch her breath. Jamal leaned against the wall, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "That," Alexandria said, her voice hard, "was a warning. They're trying to scare us." Karen looked shaken but resolute. "Whatever they're trying to do, it won't work. I'm running this story." Alexandria nodded. "Good. The world needs to know what's happening." But as she turned to check the locks on the door, her phone buzzed again. Another anonymous text. "This is your last chance. Drop it, or next time, you won't be so lucky." Alexandria stared at the message, her anger boiling over. She turned to Jamal and Karen, her voice filled with determination. "They want us to be afraid, but all they've done is prove how desperate they are. We're not stopping." Jamal nodded, his fear giving way to resolve. "Let's finish this." And as Alexandria stood in that dimly lit office, the weight of the battle ahead pressing down on her, she knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. But neither was she. That night, as the city slept, a shadow moved through the quiet streets. The stranger from before stopped outside Alexandria's building, staring up at her office window. He made a call, his voice low and controlled. "She's not backing down." The voice on the other end replied calmly. "Then it's time to make her." The man hung up and disappeared into the night, leaving only the faint echo of his footsteps behind.